On a cold Christmas Eve in 1944, disaster struck at sea, and a tragedy unfolded that still haunts history. Today, we're diving into the story of the SS Leopoldville, a Belgian passenger liner turned troop ship during World War II. While sailing between Southampton and Cherbourg, this once grand ship met a tragic end when she was torpedoed by the German U-boat U-486. But the real horror doesn't just lie in the sinking itself, it's in the staggering loss of life. Hello everybody, it's Jamie from Old Shipping Lines. Join me as we explore the rise and fall of the SS Leopoldville, from her construction in early years to the heart-wrenching events that unfolded on that fateful Christmas Eve. The vessel would be owned by Compagnie Maritime Belge and constructed by the shipbuilders John Cockerill S.A. in Hoboken, Antwerp, in Belgium. In terms of specifics, the ship would have had a gross tonnage of 11,256 gross registered tons. Her length would measure 478 feet 8 inches with a beam of 62 feet 2 inches, powered by two 1,019 net horsepower 4-cylinder quadruple expansion steam engines. The engines would drive twin screw propellers, enabling the ship to reach a speed of 16 knots. The vessel would be launched on September 26, 1928 and completed in 1929. In 1936, two Bauer-Vach low-pressure exhaust turbines were installed, with each turbine driving one of the shafts through double reduction gearing and a Föhdinger fluid coupling. Each turbine operated using exhaust steam from the piston engine on the same shaft. This was the fifth vessel to bear the name Leopoldville, and she initially served the route between Belgium and its African colony, the Belgian Congo. When Belgium entered World War II in May 1940, the SS Leopoldville was returning from Matadi and was rerouted to La Pallice, France, before heading back to Matadi in June. She then made voyages to New York and Liverpool, where she was converted into a troop ship. After several hazardous trips across the North Atlantic, Leopoldville was reassigned to the South Atlantic, where she transported troops between various ports. She later took part in the North African Campaign and the Allied invasion of Sicily. By April 1944, the ship was preparing for Operation Overlord, completing 24 voyages between the Solent and Normandy, ferrying over 53,000 troops. In total, she carried 124,220 troops during the war. Leopoldville was hastily loaded for the Battle of the Bulge, with 2,223 reinforcements from the 262nd and 264th Regiments of the 66th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The troops were loaded as they arrived, disrupting the regimental command structure rather than being grouped by their units. A 24-man detachment was assigned to operate the ship's defensive guns. The Belgian crew, including 93 Africans from the Belgian Congo, received orders in Flemish. Captain Charles Limbour, who took command in 1942, spoke no English. There was a shortage of life jackets, and the lifeboat drill was poorly supervised, with few troops taking part. On 24th December at 9 a.m., the Leopoldville set sail from Southampton as part of convoy WEP-3, crossing the English Channel to Cherbourg. The ship sailed in a diamond formation, accompanied by 4 escorts, the destroyers HMS Brilliant and HMS Anthony, the frigate HMS Hotham, the French frigate Croix de Lorraine, and another troopship Cheshire. On board, the experience for the soldiers was far from comfortable. The former ocean liner, originally designed to accommodate around 360 passengers, was retrofitted to carry over 2,000 troops by converting the spacious cargo holds into cramped troop compartments. The soldiers were packed together under low ceilings and between wooden partition walls. After enduring long waits to board, most soldiers had little choice but to rest on the floor or on hard wooden benches, with only a few fortunate enough to secure a hammock. As the voyage continued, the mix of seasick soldiers and poor quality food created a foul, nauseating smell. With no proper ventilation, some soldiers, despite the freezing winds and orders to remain below deck, sneaked out to the deck to catch a breath of fresh air. Lieutenant Wood recalls the meals provided to the ordinary troops.
Infantry soldiers didn't expect first-class service, but what we got was bottom of the barrel. A bucket filled with some kind of green, foul-smelling stew was lowered down the stairwells with a rope. They let it hang on each level, just long enough for every man, if he had a strong enough stomach, to scoop out a portion with his mess tin. It didn't take long before the latrines were clogged.
Soldier Walter Blunt made his way down the steep stairs to his assigned compartment. As he looked around, he saw a few hammocks hastily strung up between picnic-style wooden tables and benches with no other space to sit or sleep. Walter spent part of the day on deck playing cards with his best friend Harold Dessel, both of them assuming they would arrive in Cherbourg within a few hours. After a while, they returned to their compartment, where they passed the time reading, chatting, and playing more cards.
In the early evening, after we had eaten chow, I started feeling a little seasick, so I lay down for a while. I quickly fell asleep on a bench at the first dining table on the right side of the compartment. Some of my comrades slept on the table, under the table, and on the benches around me. Almost all of them would later be among the dead or missing.
His friend Harold Dessel also needed a nap and was peacefully sleeping on the floor beside Walter. Preparing the soldiers for a potential attack during the crossing wasn't a priority for either the Belgian crew or the American officers. Despite this being the first time the convoy sailed in this formation, there was a sense of confidence in the commanding officer's experience. This was reflected in the very basic briefing on emergency procedures. Some officers did take the time to inform their troops about the life jackets, but there was no mention of the lifeboats. The Americans were told where to report in an emergency, but they had no idea what to do once they got there. Although the ship remained relatively calm, the officers could have suspected that danger was nearby. The previous day, a ship en route to Cherbourg had been torpedoed. As a precaution, the escorting vessels dropped depth charges along the way, and the convoy followed a zigzag course across the channel to make it harder for potential attackers to target them. At 5:54 p.m., the Leopoldville was within 5 miles of the coast of Cherbourg when one of two torpedoes fired by U-486 struck the starboard side aft. The torpedo exploded in the number 4 hold, killing approximately 300 men as compartments E4, F4, and G4 flooded. On the bridge, Charles Limbour, François Vervorst, and First Officer Brognon felt the ship shake from the explosion. Even from their position, the deafening blast was followed by the sound of windows shattering around them. The alarm blared and orders quickly rang out through the bridge's loudspeakers. The crew knew their roles and immediately sprang into action. Following the captain's orders, Maître d'hôtel René Sautiot and Vercruis went to check the cabins. To ensure no crew members had been left behind, Vercruis soon reported that deck F4 had collapsed and compartment 4 was flooding. The bridge apparently signaled Cherbourg about the hit, but no response came. Verwoerd and Captain de Pierrepont stayed at their posts. What they saw was a chaotic scene of broken tables, twisted steel, and lifeless bodies. In the engine room, mechanic Robert Gossai was jolted by the sudden explosion. Grabbing the phone, he reported to the bridge that the starboard propeller had likely been damaged and that the watertight doors had been closed. Captain Limbor asked if the portside engine was still operational. After confirming it was, Limbor ordered, "All right, continue with that one." As the engine room slowly began to flood, Gossai and his crewmates realized they would soon be trapped. They set up a few pumps, but their attention quickly shifted to the other engine, where they discovered a crucial cooling cable had snapped. With the ship listing more, water poured into the engine room, making the pumps ineffective. The men contacted Limbor once again, who ordered them to evacuate to the upper deck, but only after taking necessary precautions against fire. Meanwhile, on the bridge, secret documents were discarded overboard, and the manual detailing the ship's zigzag maneuvers was shredded. In the holds below, hundreds of American soldiers were trapped. Like the others, Walter Blunt felt a surge of panic.
I stamped my feet and struggled in an attempt to stay above the water, which I eventually managed. But with the terrible waves, there was barely any space to catch my breath. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Was I doomed to die here like a rat in a trap? I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black, and in the churning water I faintly heard men groaning and frantically calling for help. I muttered a quick prayer and thought of my wife and child. I didn't give up and told myself there had to be a way out. Again, I thought about how awful it was to die as it became more hopeless and I felt weaker. Then finally there was a break in the waves and I could distinguish a light on my right side. I swam toward that light and found an opening. I pulled myself up to chest height, but I couldn't go further. The waves were coming faster, and the water seemed to rise. I lifted my head as high as I could, and with each wave I held my breath as long as I could. The waves seemed to hit 3 times, then a short break. I was feeling weaker and weaker. When there was just a break and the waves started again, I heard a voice above me. "Give me your hand, son, you'll be all right." It was the voice of my company commander. I stretched my arm as high as I could, and after 3 waves I was out of the opening. I stumbled through some debris to the deck where I collapsed, exhausted. On the deck everything was so quiet, so calm. I suppose I never realized what would have happened if I hadn't been below deck when the torpedo hit.
The torpedo caused a massive breach in the hull of the Leopoldville, and water quickly flooded the hold. Several hundred men drowned almost instantly. The explosion also destroyed the stairs and passageways leading to the deck, trapping many others in the swiftly flooding aft compartments. Albert Montagna was one of those trapped.
When I heard the explosion, I knew we had been hit. The blast reverberated even as I was already underwater. For a moment, I thought I was at the bottom of the ocean because I couldn't move. I suspected it wouldn't be long before I would die. So I waited. I heard injured men screaming in my compartment. The stairs to the upper deck had been shattered into rubble. Tables that had been set an hour earlier with our food were now smashed to pieces. Steel pipes were snapped like toothpicks.
The situation in the affected compartments was almost surreal, as testified by Rodney Boudwin.
Despite the fact that the men were sleeping on the tables or in hammocks, some without life vests, there was no panic when the water began to rise. The men in my compartment stumbled around, bewildered, searching for an exit. The explosion splintered tables, benches, and other wooden materials, pinning men to the floor or against the walls. As a result, many were unable to escape from the rapidly rising water. The explosion had torn away the stairs and cable ladders, causing them to collapse, making escape from the lower compartments impossible.
The torpedo struck at the location where 170 soldiers from F Company of the 262nd Regiment were resting. Their staff sergeant, Joseph Sykon, had just returned from the foul-smelling latrines when the stairs beneath him collapsed.
I fell a bit downward into the rubble. Around me, I immediately saw the water rushing in. I managed to save myself, but saw that the water was rising very quickly. With a few others, I threw ropes down. We managed to help 3 men that way. Our captain descended to help his men. We heard shouting and screaming until it suddenly went completely silent. The water had risen above us. Our captain and all those men drowned. We made our way toward Deck B, where the lifeboats were supposed to be.
154 men from F Company did not survive the impact, and only 9 of their bodies would be recovered. Of the 16 survivors, 6 were injured. William Kalinowski woke up submerged in ice-cold water, unable to see anything. As he tried to move, he realized he was trapped under a collapsed wall, with the water rising up to his shoulders. He pushed with all his strength to move the debris, but it was futile. Shifting left or right offered no escape. Meanwhile, the water kept rising steadily. William could only gasp for air before another wave of cold water hit him. In a final, desperate effort, he broke free, crawling through the wreckage, toward a faint light where the staircase had been. He climbed over debris and the bodies of his comrades, pushing aside the mass of wood that blocked the exit. When he finally reached the deck, his sergeant caught sight of him. William was trembling uncontrollably, and he was taken to a medical station to tend to his head wounds. Lying on a hospital bed, he saw the man next to him had no face, with a clamp holding his tongue in place to prevent it from being swallowed. Horrified, William recoiled. Soon after, he was informed that the wounded, still able to walk, needed to report to the lifeboats. He straightened up, grabbed his shoes, draped a blanket over his shoulders, and hurried toward the lifeboats. There was still a spot for him.
1 minute we were hanging 15 meters in the air. The next minute, the bottom of the lifeboat almost crashed against a wall of water.
The boat tipped over, and the men fell into the ice-cold water. William floated on the debris from the lifeboat and made a daring leap to a larger rescue boat. He barely managed to grab the rail, and a sailor helped him aboard. Immediately after the explosion, all the troops around me put on their life vests and calmly made their way to the deck, recalls American Captain Clyde Dinwiddie, remembering the remarkable calm and discipline.
My company, together with another, had to assemble at the bow on the upper deck. The men quickly took their positions, and a roll call was taken. There were many lights on. Some of the crew members were smoking cigarettes. We were waiting for instructions from the bridge. We sent a small group of volunteers below to search our compartment for blankets and coats to give the men some warmth until they were able to leave the ship.
There was no real panic on the deck. Most of the men were unaware of the gravity of the situation below them. To those on the deck, it appeared as though the ship wasn't sinking. However, on the bridge, the Belgian crew began to understand that the situation was dire. Captain Charles Limbour ordered that everyone except the essential crew members must abandon ship. He signaled to Captain Pringle on the HMS Brilliant, informing him that the stern of the Leopoldville was slowly sinking. With the ship drifting out of the mine-free zone, Captain Pringle ordered an anchor drop. Limbour carried out this order around 6:15 p.m. This decision made it impossible to tow the ship to Cherbourg, where the soldiers could have been safely evacuated. As a result, the entire ship had to be evacuated at sea, leading to dozens more deaths and injuries. The HMS Brilliant sailed toward the Leopoldville, while the other ships, under Captain Pringle's orders, began searching for the German U-boat. Their depth charges created large waves that rocked the sinking ship. About 15 minutes later, Captain Pringle's vessel passed alongside the doomed Leopoldville. Several witnesses recall waiting patiently on the deck for evacuation. The American soldiers passed the time by smoking and joking, making light of how they'd probably arrive too late in Cherbourg. It wasn't until the first wounded and dead were brought up that the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Was the ship really going to sink? On the deck, the wounded received first aid from their comrades. Their soaked bodies shielded from the biting cold with blankets as their open wounds were tended to. Beneath them, the soldiers could hear and feel the ship creaking ominously. First, Lieutenant Royden Keddy recalls how he and the other officers did their best to keep the troops under control.
By 6:15 p.m., all the men who were still able to walk had gathered on the deck. All passages had been cleared except for the access hole on the aft deck. From that hole, cries for help were heard. Some officers and their men showed incredible courage and strength by descending into the hole along the steel ladders, never thinking about their own safety. The medical staff of the onboard hospital, assisted by the soldiers, worked tirelessly and efficiently.
Walter Blunt lay on the deck, receiving help from the medical staff. His face was covered in blood, and it seemed his hips had been crushed. Blunt vaguely remembers watching his comrades being assisted for about half an hour before he was taken to a lifeboat. A soldier with a shattered knee sat beside him, writhing in pain and asking Walter to hold his leg still to avoid worsening the agony. The lifeboat was lowered unevenly, hanging at a dangerous angle. A Congolese crew member skillfully climbed up the rope, hand over hand, until he reached the deck. There, he untied the rope, causing the lifeboat to plunge nose first into the water. Walter feared the boat would sink, but to his relief, it stabilized. They were saved. Captain Clyde Dinwiddie was still waiting with his company on the upper deck.
The men were sitting or standing when they saw the crew pushing the lifeboats overboard. They watched as the wounded were transferred to a small harbour boat that had come alongside, and others risked jumping into another boat. None of my men wanted to leave the ship or take the leap. We checked the life vests.
It is striking that witnesses do not recall any real panic. Some even went back to their cabins to retrieve personal belongings. Hundreds of soldiers stood on the deck of the sinking Leopoldville, waiting for their evacuation. The last of the wounded were hauled up. While there was some order on the deck, the evacuation with the lifeboats was chaotic. The Americans received little help from the Belgian crew, and some soldiers even claimed they were abandoned by the crew, who seemed more concerned with their own safety. A few witnesses recall seeing a Congolese man standing by with suitcases and his parrot, ready to leave. Whether these stories are true is difficult to confirm. The difficult rescue operation was coordinated from the HMS Brilliant, which had sailed alongside the Leopoldville. Encouraged by the sailors on the HMS Brilliant, the soldiers on the deck of the Leopoldville took the risky leap to the other ship. Sergeant Villa recalled,
"We climbed over the rail and held onto the side as the rough sea caused the destroyer to sway back and forth. I wanted Charlie to jump first so I would know he made it, but he knew that. and insisted that I jump first. To this day, I don't know who went first. After the jump, we embraced like two long-separated brothers.
Many soldiers hesitated. Often a soldier would fail to reach the other ship, falling into the water between the two swaying vessels and getting crushed as the ships collided. U.S. Lieutenant Bill Everhard had to encourage his men to take the leap. He waited for the perfect moment when the two ships were at their furthest distance from each other. Some hesitated too long and fell. Soon, the men jumped in groups of 15. On the other side, the British sailors were ready to catch them and help those who jumped just short, but managed to grab the rail. Then, Bill took the leap himself. He leaned forward, let go, and pushed off. He landed safely on the deck of the HMS Brilliant. Looking back at the sinking ship, the horror he saw caused him to vomit. The 8-meter jump was risky, and many soldiers sustained broken limbs or other injuries. Bill pulled himself together and continued to encourage the hundreds of comrades still on the deck of the Leopoldville. The horrific sight of men missing their leap for life and being crushed between the two ships caused many to hesitate. But there were few alternatives. The evacuation by lifeboats had not gone as planned. Still, everything on the deck remained relatively calm. At 7:30 p.m., dusk began to fall. The HMS Brilliant was forced to sail toward Cherbourg, as there were no more men left on the ship. Lieutenant Everhard recalls the departure.
Everywhere you looked, you saw men in the waves, shouting for help and waving their arms, hoping to be seen.
Empty lifeboats were still hanging from the ship. After much struggle, some soldiers managed to escape the sinking vessel this way, but not long after, the water had already reached the deck. Around 8 p.m., the Belgian captain decided that most of his crew had to leave the ship. Since most of the American officers had received little information about the evacuation plans, the majority of the officers were now Belgian. A spontaneous rescue operation began from Cherbourg. More than 30 small ships set sail toward the sinking vessel to rescue the soldiers drowning in the water. Due to the growing darkness, the operation became increasingly difficult, with ships sometimes sailing over the swimming soldiers. They had trouble getting close, as a collision with the large ship could prove fatal. Around 8:30 p.m., a loud explosion rang out, causing the cross beam of the Leopoldville to collapse. A second explosion followed, plunging the nearly 1,000 Americans still on the deck into chaos. In a panic, soldiers began cutting the ropes holding the lifeboats with knives. Sergeant Daniel Rosenberg recalls,
"Hell broke loose. Men ran, slid, and jumped overboard in all directions. Stairs, masts, cables, and other parts of the ship were flying through the air. I tried to grab the railing but failed, and my foot got stuck in a cable. I tried to free myself but couldn't. It seemed like my end had come. Only when the ship started shaking did I break free, but then I slipped, heading toward the dark water. Just in time, I managed to grab onto a piece of a staircase that had remained attached to the ship. I stood up and jumped as far into the water as I could. Fortunately, a wave carried me further away from the ship, otherwise the suction would have pulled me under."
The Leopoldville was now so tilted to port that the soldiers on deck could no longer stand upright. Like Daniel Rosenberg, they struggled to hold onto the railing. Some tried to rid themselves of their heavy helmets and ammunition, but the discarded gear fell onto the men in the sea below. Inexperienced soldiers, still wearing their tightened life vests and strapped helmets, broke their necks when they fell into the unforgiving water. Lieutenant Werdeman, who had witnessed the initial torpedo strike, was still aboard.
Most of the men were crushed against the railing on starboard as they panicked and jumped from the ship. It wasn't until the water reached the deck that I got into a lifeboat still on deck. The water caused the lifeboat to drift away from the ship, and I was able to help 5 men aboard.
The last lifeboat departed at 7:55 p.m., and by then, all the rafts had been thrown overboard with the remaining troops clinging to them. A tugboat tried to pick up the last crew members from the ship, Limbour, Verwoerd, Van de Kerkhove, and Hoor. During the final moments of the ship, some lifeboats passed over the scene, rescuing survivors from the rafts and lifeboats. It was just after 9 p.m. when the Leopoldville began to sink rapidly. Hundreds of Americans were floating in the icy water, hoping to be rescued quickly. Not all the men had life vests, and many barely knew how to put them on. I will never forget being pulled down with the ship, remembers Norman Bullitt.
I was sucked down until an explosion threw me back to the surface. It was so terrifying in the water. All I could see were men desperately shouting for help. The bow of the Leopoldville sank down. The men still on it jumped. I don't know how long I stayed in the water, but I felt myself starting to freeze. I grabbed onto a drifting ladder. Rescue workers threw ropes, which we had to tie around our waists, and they pulled us aboard their boat. But my fingers were too numb, and I exhaustedly drifted away between the waves. Then a large wave pulled me back to the surface, close to the rescue boat. 3 soldiers managed to grab me and pull me aboard.
At around 7 p.m., someone from the bridge addressed us, recalls American Captain Clyde Dinwiddie, who remained on the upper deck until the end.
He expressed his appreciation for the order and discipline my men had shown on the ship. I assume this man was the captain of the ship.
His colleague, Captain William Pursley, remembers something similar.
As far as I know, all orders were followed without too much noise. I was impressed by the way the non-commissioned officers gallantly assisted in the evacuation of their men, especially in the last 10 minutes when panic set in, and most of the ship was underwater. Even in the water, I heard them encouraging the men. Move your arms and feet, raise your head when you breathe, and keep your mouth closed. On the other hand, I'm convinced the crew did little, because they were only concerned with their own safety.
For Clyde Dinwiddie, it was time to leave the ship.
At around 8:20 p.m., the ship tilted so strongly to port that it began to sink from the stern. The order to throw the helmets off the deck and jump overboard was given. By that time, the men were clinging to the rails to get into the water via the deck. Rafts slid across the deck and hit some men. When I left, there were only 3 men left on the deck. They clung to a small lifeboat and refused to let go. As I swam away from the ship, men were everywhere. Some were trying to reach a raft, others clung to debris or floating backpacks. We seemed to be drifting quickly, and the lifeboats were far away. An hour passed, and still no boats had reached us. When the boats finally came closer, the cries for help intensified. Once we were pulled aboard, the rescuers stripped us completely, rolled us in blankets, gave us a shot of rum, and threw us onto the benches. It felt good to finally be out of the water and slowly begin to thaw. About 10 minutes after 9 p.m., the Leopoldville had sunk.
Those who were still alive were often so weak that the rescuers themselves had to jump into the icy water to pull them out. Their heavy clothing dragged the soldiers down. I had swallowed so much salt water that I vomited blood, recalls an American soldier, who was 19 at the time. Rescuers describe how their lifeboat was repeatedly blown away by the wind, causing the young soldiers to lose their grip on the ropes they had thrown to them. I remember how we went back and forth to the disaster area. The first times, we returned with survivors, and then only with bodies, sighs one of the rescuers. When the Coast Guard finally managed to attach their boat to Walter Blunt's, despite the rough seas, the American was safe at last. The rescuers laid him in the warm engine room. Soon, Walter felt nauseous and began vomiting the seawater and oil he had swallowed. He saw other survivors being brought in, many of whom were in bad shape. In Cherbourg, ambulances took them to nearby hospitals. Walter turned out to be one of the 61 wounded from Company L, while his best friend, Harold Dessel, who had slept next to him, was among the 74 dead of the company. Sergeant Daniel Rosenberg was in the water.
Although the searchlights from the rescue boats were shining on me, they didn't see me. That's when I knew I had to gather all my energy and hope for a little bit of luck. Together with other soldiers, I tried to reach a floating raft made of debris. I managed to climb over the side. It wasn't until an hour later that a searchlight from a rescue boat focused on us. As we held our breath, we waved frantically. Suddenly, it seemed like a voice came from the sky. "Hold on, we're almost there." That voice broke through the darkness. The boat came closer, and they threw a rope to us. One by one, we were pulled aboard. Soaked and shivering from the cold, we were undressed and wrapped in blankets and placed on a bench. The cold was unbearable. We were undressed, wrapped in blankets, and placed on a bench.
768 crew members perished. Of the 763 American victims, only 248 could later be identified, while a staggering 464 were never found. Captain Charles Limbour, along with first carpenter André van de Kerkhoff, was among the last to leave the ship. The two Belgians, along with 3 Congolese men, vanished forever into the waves. The total number of casualties has always been a subject of debate. Some sources report that 802 Americans died. But this uncertainty stems from the confusion surrounding the passenger list of the Leopoldville. The list had been filled out inaccurately, and since most of the bodies were dragged down into the depths with the sinking ship, proper identification afterward was impossible. Captain Charles Limbour also went down with the ship. Documents about the attack remained classified until 1996. Soldiers from the 66th Infantry Division were told not to speak of the ship's sinking, and their letters home were censored by the Army throughout the rest of World War II. After the war, they were further instructed not to discuss the sinking of the SS Leopoldville with the press, under threat of losing their GI benefits once they became civilians. In July 1984, Clive Cussler of NUMA announced that he had discovered the wreck, as her size and position pose a potential hazard to navigation. Cussler contends that the wreck's location is incorrect, and that its true position is about a mile to the south. A memorial to the sinking can be found in Weymouth, Dorset in the United Kingdom, as well as at Fort Moore Main Post Cemetery in Georgia in the USA. In addition, Massachusetts passed legislation on November 20th, 2007, establishing December 24th as an annual day of remembrance for the event. As the icy waters swallowed the sinking Leopoldville, the stories of those who survived and those who did not became woven into the fabric of history. Despite the chaos and uncertainty, the men aboard the Leopoldville displayed remarkable bravery. Though many perished that night, their stories were kept alive by those who survived and by the countless acts of heroism that define this tragic chapter in World War II. The wreck of the Leopoldville lies beneath the sea, but the memories of her men will never be lost. Every year, as we remember the lives lost, we honor their sacrifice and the lessons of resilience, courage, and the importance of remembrance. This tragedy, hidden in the fog of war for so many years, now stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who faced the unthinkable and never gave up. And that marks the end of a video, my friends. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Now, if you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to the channel, as that would help out the channel a lot. Now, if you have any thoughts, comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section down below, as I absolutely love reading your comments. And please let me know in the comment section down below as well what ships you would like me to cover in the future. Now be as well sure to check out our social media pages. We are on Twitter, we are on Instagram, and we also recently have a website, oldshippinglines.com, where we have articles of the ships we cover and we have book reviews as well. I think you will enjoy the website very much. Now, with that out of the way, guys, I wish you all a good night or day, wherever you are. Stay safe, stay happy, and we will see each other on the next video. Goodbye, my friends.